So we're going to be moving from part one into part two, but I want to wrap up and kind of start to pull together, not completely, but to get you started for your kind of part one sort of major discussion that should bring together your lecture content, your reading content. I'm going to give you some kind of starting points here for some of those questions, some of those options for that. And in fact, we'll look at it really quickly here, right? So if you go to your Blackboard, you go to the content modules, and you see we're in part one, and under that part one submitted overview discussion exercise, right? Submitted as opposed to this is not going to take place in a discussion board. This is one you just submit to me. It will say discussion because it's graded as that discussion portion of your grade, but it's just a submission through Blackboard, a PDF, Word document, something like that. And so there are actually more than five. I need to change that. But you see there your general instructions, which is this. It needs to show that you're familiar with the text, that you're interacting with the lectures, and that you kind of come to your own thought out conclusions related to those things, right? About two paragraphs. Pretty simple, but not simplistic, right? I want you to really think about what you've read and what I've said. So there are options, 1, 2, and 3. You only have to do one of these. You submit it down here where it says submit discussion exercise part 1 overview response by July 5th. I will probably stretch that out till Monday. We'll change that date. But I will just go ahead and change it now. So you can see because I was a little late getting this, I've changed a few things as we've gone. So we'll say by Monday. You need to have that in, and it's just, like I said, just a couple of paragraphs submitted there, Word document, PDF, something like that. Your options are, so you can consider Socrates' discussion of power in relation to what one wants and wishes, what is genuinely beneficial and what seems good is gratifying, perhaps evil. So did you explain that? How do you understand the relationship according to Socrates? Do you agree or disagree with him? Why or why not? And in this lecture here, I'll be talking about some of these aspects from Paulus and Socrates' discussion, so that might help you if you want to do that option. Option 2 for this assignment, right, is conversation between Socrates and Callicles about power, pleasure, temperance, and the good. You could discuss a lot here. I don't need a comprehensive evaluation because it's a very long discussion. But I want you to discuss the points you find most compelling or difficult and explain why it's compelling or difficult, again related to some of the things that I'll talk about in this lecture and that I've talked about in previous lectures. Which side, Socrates or Callicles, do you agree with more, and why? Why is that? So that's option 2. Option 3 is we're discussing this idea of individualism and the Enlightenment, which I've talked about a little bit in the discussion on non-consequential kind of modern ethical approaches. But individualism that underpins the modern Western view of human nature, especially in Hobbes and Rousseau. There's some texts linked here that you can look at. I mentioned some texts, and there's one attached here. I mentioned some text elsewhere in the material. I gave some quotes in one of the lectures. So you need to look at the differences between those two views and what do those two hold in common, kind of around that individualism aspect. Then you need to think about, do both of these they propose a type of contract to maintain social order, And I have one more lecture after this one on dealing with the Creto, and moving forward into preparing you for part two of this course. But with the Creto, a lot of people say that, oh, that's contract theory of government. Socrates is, saying you're part of the contract. You have to obey the laws all the time. And they're saying that, on that level, Socrates is essentially saying the same thing as Hobbes and Rousseau. Do you think that's right? I mean, spoiler, I don't. You'll hear that. You've probably already heard some of it in the lectures on ethics. Um, you'll see some of it in the lecture on the Creto. But those are the things. So that's option number 3. Again, you only have to do one of these 3 options and submit it by next Monday. It'll relate to these last couple of lectures in this section. So speaking of that, let's kind of jump into this lecture, right? So you may or may not be familiar with what this image is, but this is a representation of Plato's allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave is a portion of Plato's Republic, and the Republic is a dialogue of sorts. It's written differently than the others. You've seen the Gorgias, right? You might have by now seen the Creto. You will if you haven't already. You need to pretty quickly here. Where like it says Socrates, and you get what Socrates says. You get Paulus and what Paulus says. You get Callicles or somebody else, right? And what they say, like a play. It's always written like a play. Plato had been a playwright, but the Republic is not written that way. The Republic is kind of a story within a story. Plato is recording Socrates telling about a dialogue he had. It can, if you're not careful, get really confusing to read. And there's been a lot talked about with the whole of the Republic, with the allegory of the cave itself. Is the cave symbolic of the human soul? Is the Republic symbolic of the human soul? Where, the governing elite is the reason, and then the soldiers are the sort of rightly trained passions, and then the commoners are the body, and Plato is just creating an allegory. The whole thing's an allegory. Or some have thought, no, Plato is really presenting you with what he thinks is an ideal republic, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the cave itself, the allegory of the cave, is important and needs to be taken seriously for however you read the Republic as a whole. It's sort of a hinge part of the Republic. And in the allegory of the cave, Socrates tells the story. He says, so life is like this. Life, there's like the people there. You can see kind of to the left of that law, the little kind of strip of the picture that's left there. You see the people with a piece of wood running behind them with chains around their neck. They're chained into place with their backs against this wall, and they're facing the wall of the cave, right? And behind the wall that's behind them, the brick wall, is a flame, and servants walk past with these like silhouette things that cast shadows on the wall. So it creates for them like a shadow puppet show, right? And Plato says, or Socrates in the story says, so what the cave is like is that this is happening, and people on earth are like the people that are chained there looking at the cave wall, and they all think the really clever ones are the ones who can figure out the patterns of the shadows that are going past. And everybody kind of congratulates the clever ones who figure out the patterns and can tell you what's going to come next, right? That's what they all want to look for. But the philosopher in the allegory is like the one who breaks out of the chains and goes past the wall and past the fire and goes out of the cave into the reality of the world and sees reality, sees the trees and the sky, the sun. He sees representation of truth, the real world, right? And then when he comes back into the cave, well, he wants to tell the others about that, but they can't comprehend what he's saying. And furthermore, he can't really see well enough in the cave to see that he's been, in essence, for all purposes, in the cave, he's blinded by the outside light. His eyes haven't acclimated to the darkness. So he seems foolish to the people in the cave looking at the wall. And compared to those who can understand the patterns of the shadows going across the cave wall, he seems like a total idiot. But in reality, he's the one that's had a glimpse of real life. So that is the allegory of the cave, and that allegory of the cave is talking about the philosopher who seeks truth and true wisdom. And for Plato, to some degree, that's Socrates himself. Now, the Republic, as it's outlined, is discussion of a vision of of justice and a just society. It's based on a class system. There's the common people that just do the things they do. The shoemakers, the bakers, the farmers. They all do their own thing, and they're pretty much free to do their thing, to sell their wares. But in relation to just governing, well, the governing is left in the hands of there's a class system, and so there's a protector class, and from that protector class is chosen a philosopher king, and that the protector class goes through very strict educational standards to be in order to be just, and that education involves censorship for them. Now, everybody's not censored, just the protector class, from whom the philosopher king is chosen. So that's an intriguing idea. People have said, "Oh, this is Plato's real idea of a just society and what it looks like." Um, but if you think about the allegory of the cave, and you think about Plato's idea of justice and truth and the importance of knowledge versus mere opinion, if you think about even the way, if Socrates is the philosopher, and Socrates is the philosopher who sees more truth than others, the greatest truth Socrates claims to see is that he doesn't know anything, which is a sort of ironic point in itself, right? What he knows, the reason Socrates is wiser than everyone is he knows how little he knows, but everyone else thinks they know. So there's already a conflict there between Plato's philosopher king and Plato's ideal philosopher, Socrates, who refuses to take political leadership. But here's internally, even before you get to the cave allegory, even before you think about Socrates himself, if a philosopher is to know and to be wise, how does he become wise if he's the one being censored? This seems to be in conflict, right? Because one of Socrates' rules for the philosopher should search out truth through question and answer. And furthermore, when you read the dialogues of Plato, Socrates frequently quotes from the very things. In fact, in the context of the Republic, Socrates quotes from Homer two different times the same passage to make two opposing points, right? Which Plato's not being an idiot, he's using irony. He wants you to pick up on Socrates' sort of hints at the problem. What are the hints of the problem? Well, Socrates in this story of the Republic is having a conversation with some wealthy young men, and they're saying, "Well, we want to talk about a just society." Socrates, what does a just society look like? How do we have a just society? And so Socrates says, "Well, you know what I think a just society looks like," and he basically describes something akin to like a small town where everyone has their skills, their abilities, and freedom to do that. And they're all very temperate and self-controlled people. They're all have been trained to be wise and do well what they do, recognize their own limitations, not be greedy for other people's stuff, to have the food they need, to live, to walk around barefoot in the winter, I mean, in the summer, and have, basic shoes in the winter, and the same with clothes. Basically, not wear much in the summer because it's hot, and have enough warm clothes and blankets for the winter, and food enough to be healthy, and be married, but only have enough sex to have enough children that they can afford, and not, if they can't afford more kids, to abstain, to be self-controlled, temperate, and that's a just society. And the young men are like, they're laughing at Plato. I mean, at Socrates, like, that's crazy. Socrates, like, you can't have a city like this. Not a city. What is that? Like, nobody wants to live in that. And so this is where this quote picks up in the Republic. Socrates says to one of the young men, "So how should I feed these people, Glaucon?" And Glaucon's response is, in the conventional way, if they aren't to suffer hardship, they should recline on proper couches, dine at a table. Because, Socrates' ideal little town, people didn't have comfortable couches and tables. They just had very simple houses with very simple furnishings. But he's saying they should dine, at these tables and have delicacies and desserts that people have nowadays. Now, this is another point of irony for Plato's writing, right? Because part of the point is that Socrates is critical of Athens. Athens is not a just society. Athens is full of corruption and problems. And the young men are asking, how do we make it just? Socrates is giving them an answer, and they're complaining because they want it to be like the way we have it. But then Socrates' response is very interesting. He says, all right, I understand. It isn't merely the origin of a city that we're considering, it seems, but the origin of a luxurious city. That may not be a bad idea. Look at why it may not be a bad idea. For by examining it, we might very well see how justice and injustice grow up in cities. Now, that wasn't where they started. Originally, they wanted to know how a city became a just city. And immediately Socrates says, oh, once you have a luxurious city, well, you've moved away from self-control and temperance. And so you're not going to have a justice city. We're going to look at now how justice and injustice grow up. But then he says, yet in the true city, in my opinion, is the one we've described, the healthy one. In other words, that small town, simple life, temperate life, self-controlled people, living simply, having what they need, and being at peace with one another. He said, but let's study a city with a fever, if that's what you want. In other words, he's saying once you get to a luxurious city, you've moved away from temperance, you've moved away from self-control, you've moved away from wisdom, and you're not going to have a just city. You're not going to have a just society. You're going to see how justice and injustice grow up together in a society. So the argument that we find in the Gorgias is rooted in this question of justice, of injustice, of what a just society looks like, what a just society is based upon. Right. So what does Gorgias teach? Right. That's the kind of the opening question. And Paulus is like, oh, it's the greatest of arts. It's the most wonderful thing. And Socrates is like, whoa. That's what I'm asking is, what is it? Right. If somebody makes shoes, they're a cobbler. If somebody makes bread, they're a baker. If somebody helps sick people, they're a doctor. Like, what is it that Gorgias is? Right. And he teaches rhetoric. He's a rhetorician. And Paulus wants to say this is the greatest art. Paulus himself is paying Gorgias to learn it. But then Socrates says, okay, well, let's clarify what is that? What is rhetoric? What does rhetoric involve? And so you get all that discussion about, well, it's the art of speech. And Socrates, well, a doctor or mathematician, they use a lot of speech to perform their arts. And understand, too, in this context, art means a skill that requires knowledge. It's important to understand that because knowledge, as opposed to opinion, is an important thing to consider in everything Plato writes, but especially here. Right? What is knowledge? How does your art, is it an art? Can it be an art if it's not rooted in knowledge? And so Socrates wants to compare it. He says, a doctor, a trainer, a manager. He makes the comparison on a couple levels. Like the doctor helps you become healthy, the trainer helps you to maintain bodily health, the manager helps you to become wealthy. Right? These three, they pertain to different realms of knowledge that help you have a better life. And he says, they'll compete with each other over whose is the most important. But you're saying, rhetoric is the most important. And, Socrates doesn't buy that. Here's why. Doctor, trainer, manager, they require real knowledge of how the body works, of how sickness works, of how money works, of how society works. What is the rhetoric? What's the law? What is it that the knowledge that rhetoric depends upon? Does it depend upon knowledge? That's the question. So when we get to what is that, here's the issue. What Gorgias wants to say is it's the art of persuasion, right? And that he says, if a doctor and a rhetorician were to speak to a crowd about a medical issue, it would be the rhetorician who would win every time. And Socrates clarifies, you mean even though he's not speaking with knowledge? And Gorgias is like, well, yes, I help my brother, who's a doctor, all the time to convince someone to take their medicine that they won't take for the doctor through the mere power of persuasion and language. So why is this a problem for Socrates? What does he see rhetoric as? Right? It's a knack. It's not an art. Why is it not an art? What does he mean? It's not rooted in knowledge. It's not based on knowledge. He says it's a knack that some people have if they're given to boldness, if they're shrewd at guesswork. This is from, it's in the, you can see that in the dialogue, the Allen pages. Sorry, I usually use that a certain translation when I have an in-person class, but you can find it in the dialogue where he talks about, where Socrates talks about that rhetoric is a knack. It's sort of a natural tendency, but it's not an art because an art requires knowledge. This is not about knowledge. This is about tendencies and personality. So this whole discussion of belief versus knowledge comes in here is integral to everything that's going on. Socrates questions Gorgias, right, at one point, and he says, does rhetoric persuade through use of knowledge or persuade through use of opinion and belief? Knowledge is true. Knowledge for Socrates is the truth. You don't have false knowledge. If you have false knowledge, it's not knowledge, it's ignorance, right? But you can have a true or false belief, he says. You can believe something to be true and be wrong about it. You think you have knowledge, but you don't. Right? And this is integral for the rest of the conversation on a lot of levels. But when it comes to rhetoric, this is what bothers Socrates about rhetoric and why he says it can't be an art. Right? Because Gorgias himself, he says, well, it's about, it's about persuading people in lawmaking and in the courts of law and in court cases, right? That's what rhetoric is meant to produce. And Socrates asks him, so does it produce persuasion according to knowledge or persuasion according to belief and opinion? And Gorgias himself says, no, it produces belief, not knowledge. So it draws someone to your opinion, apart from any real knowledge that they might or might not have. This is the problem for Socrates because he believes that Athens has been a corrupt and corrupting and corrupted society, and it's growing more and more so. And people think themselves wise when they're not. They think themselves to have knowledge when they're actually ignorant. And there are people who make money persuading others to do things, who persuade others to follow their lead, to get them what they want. Nothing is based in knowledge, nothing is based in truth, and it all leads to corruption and this sort of competition for the most, who can get the most of what, and they do so through what rhetoric. So when Socrates is saying, now Gorgias, are you saying that you would teach your students justice along with rhetoric? And Gorgias is like, well, yeah, like a boxer can teach somebody else how to box, but you don't blame them if they go out and use their skill as a boxer to rob people. The boxing trainer never trained them to do that. He just trained them in the skill of boxing. Rhetoric is the same way. But Socrates is questioning that because what he sees everywhere in law courts and in the courts of making, whether it's in deciding cases or making new laws, what he sees is a rhetoric constantly being used to convince people to do things that are not true, good, or right, or just for their own benefit. Right? So this is what's going on in this dialogue. So Socrates, in the context of this, right, one of the things he's interested in is the health of the soul. Why? Because the health of the soul is what relates to justice. Just like the health of the body, that there's health of the body that matters. There's health of the soul that matters, and there's a social context to everything that Socrates is talking about here. Specifically, he says, okay, Gorgias, look, you're saying that persuasion is a good thing, but our heroes have used that. Um, Pericles has used that. He's one of our heroes. He built this portion of the conversation where Socrates talks about when it comes to like the building of docks and roads and all this kind of stuff. They accomplish that, but the question is, are they truly heroic? Are they truly just? Are they truly doing what's right? And he says, if you said to someone, come train my horses, and when they finished training your horses were wild and threw you as soon as you tried to get on them, you wouldn't think that was a good horse trainer. The men like Pericles, who used rhetoric, and essentially what Pericles and others had done was they thought they saw a threat of attack. They wanted to strengthen the ports of Athens. They wanted to build the navy. Nobody cared. Nobody would listen. So they made the case for, hey, we can protect our shipping vessels better and lose less money. You can get richer if you'll throw some money into the development of an Athenian navy. And so he built the navy and he built the ports which he wanted for the defense of the city, but he built them on a false pretext. And so a lot of people, oh, he was a hero. He tricked us into it, but he was a hero at the end of the day. But then that was momentary when they were attacked. But then years later, the very people who had made him a hero were trying to depose him and kill him. And Socrates said, see, by using deception, by misleading them, by using rhetoric to kind of convince them of something, well, somebody who can convince more easily, who do a better job, quote unquote, of rhetoric, convince the people to hate Pericles, right? To despise him. And so he didn't really make the people produce justice. He didn't do good because he didn't improve the health of people's souls. He just manipulated people to do what he thought was best for the moment, politically and financially for the city. And that, for Socrates, contributes to the corruption of the city. So when you consider that, he's saying there's really this is why rhetoric is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. And he says, furthermore, those who use it that way, right? You see it as powerful, right? You're saying that rhetoric gives you power, that you have the power to do whatever you want, to get whatever you want. That's the greatest of powers. It's like if you're the best rhetorician, you can be like a tyrant. You could kill who you want, sleep with who you want, uh, exile who you want, take what you want because you have power. And Socrates says that's not really power. And they're like, yeah, it is. Getting what you want is power. And he says, no, you're not really getting what you want. And they're like, well, why is this? And he says, well, because what you want is actually community. What you want is fellowship. What you want is peace and prosperity in life. And by becoming a tyrant, you don't get that because you don't get a key part of what it means to be human, which is you can't have friendship with gods or men. You can't have true fellowship because everything you do is based on a lie and on manipulation and on doing what seems best, which really isn't best. And so there's even this discussion of like it's possible for the powerful person to command something contrary to their own desires. And so that's part of that discussion of why power why simply doing what you think is best and power of that sort of political tyrant's power, isn't a part of justice. That justice is true power, but abusive strength or control is not necessarily justice and is therefore not necessarily real power. Because if you're the tyrant, you have no friendship, you have no fellowship with gods or men. That's a key part of what it means to be human, right? So all this discussion is really important because it relates to, I think it speaks to what I would call the modern argument. So we looked at the Gorgias argument. We want to look at the modern argument, And oftentimes, as we talked about when we were looking at the different approaches to ethics in the modern world and the kind of pluralistic, secular, non-religious efforts to come up with a ethical grounding, one of the things we saw was this tension between the common good and the individual desires. So that's a modern argument. When you look at Socrates' writings in the Gorgias, when he talks about friendship as opposed to tyranny, fellowship with gods and men, as opposed to getting what seems best to you, but really, what you think is power, but isn't real power because it doesn't give you what you want. It goes to this issue of the common good and individual desires. And in the modern argument, they're always set as two things in opposition to each other, right? You have to give up all of your individual desires or some of your individual desires, or how do you balance between your individual desires and the common good? And they're seen as something always in conflict. This is the issue of human nature. We looked a little bit at the idea of human nature when we talked about contractarian government, and we talked about the different egoists, and we talked about Rousseau and Hobbes, right, in the previous lectures. Is this the essence of human nature? This is the modern understanding of human nature. But Socrates in Plato seems to be offering us a different view of human nature, right? And part of that is because he delves into this idea of how do pleasure and desire and pain relate to each other, and how do they relate to the issues of what's good and what's bad, right? Paulus wants to say that pleasure is good, pain is bad, much like Jeremy Bentham, but Socrates makes this argument that just can't be the case. That's not reality, because I can show you things that aren't, where the bad person has more pleasure than the good person, or the good person may endure pain for the sake of the good, and you all agree that it's good and you all agree that it's painful, so they can't be the same. Furthermore, you have to ask yourself, what is it that you really desire? This is morality, ethics, and religion course. There are different approaches to desire in the different religious traditions. Um, you know, um, Most of them will say, though, not that desire itself is bad, but it's usually the idea is, well, in Christianity, Paul says, "My ambition is to," right? What is it that you desire? The Buddha in Buddhism, talks about tanha, which often gets translated desire, ridding yourself of tanha, because tanha or desire is the source of suffering. But the way you get rid of tanha is through the Eightfold Path, and one part of the Eightfold Path is right desires. So it can't merely be desire that he's talking about, right? It's just the question of right and wrong desires, which means that desire, pleasure, pain, fulfillment of desire, in a raw sense, isn't about good and bad. One scholar of Hinduism said that, Hinduism says you can have what you want, but the question is, what is it that you really want? And we'll talk about this more when we delve into in part two with the kind of some ideas that the great religious traditions, the sort of the major religious traditions, tend to share before we get into their major differences. But there are some shared ideas between the different religious traditions, and a lot of that has to relate to desire, pleasure, pain, and good versus bad. But Socrates would be on the side of those traditions, in the sense, those religious traditions that talk about that distinction. And if Socrates and the traditions are correct, then Bentham is clearly wrong, right? Pleasure cannot be the essence of goodness. Pain cannot be the essence of badness. Furthermore, John Stuart Mill is also lacking. He's not as raw and as straightforward as Bentham. He tries to make some allowance for what he would consider higher desires and lower desires. He tries to avoid the language of good and bad, similar to the way Ayn Rand tries to talk about rational self-interest or higher desires or higher goods for yourself. But you can't, if you're saying that pleasure and desire, fulfillment of desire, is the good thing, then go on to say consistently, internally consistent. There's no internal consistency to saying that, well, these pleasures are better than those pleasures. Why? If pleasure is pleasure, if pleasure is the measure, how do you distinguish? That's the challenge. Mill tends to fall apart because he still wants to relate in some way pleasure and good, pain and bad, but then he wants to say there are good reasons to suffer that outweigh pleasures that are bad. But if that's the case, then you can't say pleasure equals good. This is what Socrates gets at. So Bentham, straightforward disagreement with Socrates. Mill just is revealed as being totally inconsistent, right? Socrates would speak to Mill and essentially say, how do you get there, right? How do you say that there's higher pleasures and lower pleasures if pleasure is what you use to measure what's good and bad? Pleasure as the measure of good and bad doesn't work, even if you try to distinguish between. They can't be the same thing if you're saying there's good pleasure and bad pleasure. So this also means if Socrates and where the religious traditions agree on this, if they're right, then the egoists are completely wrong as well, right? Because Callicles sounds like Rand at some points, right? The higher, the higher ambitions. Don't be held back by the shame and the weakness and the timidity of the masses. You should excel. You should do what you want. In contrast, Socrates says, no, the temperate soul is good because there's this section where he talks about, the person who's temperate, who's law abiding, that's a good person. If you're not that way, the robber, the tyrant, they have no friends. And so, Callicles sounds like Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks about master morality, values of power and nobility and independence, as opposed to slave morality that values sympathy, kindness, and humility. Uh, you know, Nietzsche sees this as herd morality. And Nietzsche at one point says, "What is good?" Sorry, I don't know why that's popping up there, but I'll try to get rid of it very quickly. What is good? My computer. All that enhances the feeling of power, the will to power, and power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. This is reminiscent of Callicles, right? What is happening? The feeling that power is increasing. Think about Callicles saying, maximum flow. You want more, you get more, you get more to want more, you want more to get more, you get more to want more. Not peace at any price, but war, not virtue, but efficiency. This is Nietzsche's Antichrist. It's part of his philosophy, and it echoes with the statements of Callicles. Socrates is in direct conflict, right? If you think about the way Socrates conflicts directly, is directly opposed to what Callicles says, right? There's this whole discussion on nature and law, and Callicles says, no, you're confusing the two. Nature is to pursue your own good, is to to go get what you can, to be bold and courageous and seize everything you can to amass more for yourself and more, and anything contrary to that is based in shame. And Socrates says, no, law and nature, right? They're actually related to each other, right? He says temperance, right, in the health of the soul. This is a quote from Socrates in Plato in the Gorgias. He says, the regular and orderly states of the soul are called lawfulness and law, whereby men are similarly made law-abiding and orderly. And these states are justice and temperance. Right? This is what's in conflict. Callicles and Socrates are in direct conflict. So Socrates and Nietzsche are in direct conflict on what it is to be human, what is human nature, what is the essence of human nature, right? Something we'll come back to later. I just want you to think about this. The question is this view dependent upon a religious understanding of the world? At the end of the day, I will argue that it is. So I'm kind of showing my hand there a little bit. But we will have a reading very soon on the idea of evolutionary ethics based in reciprocity, right? Give and take. can you get to Socrates' idea of sort of natural law based in temperance, based on the principle of reciprocity as an evolutionary outworking of something? So we'll come back to this, but I just wanted to mention it in passing because we're going to talk about natural law, what natural law means. In some sense, Socrates and many of the religious thinkers that we'll look at, religious ideals, underpinning ideals that are shared, have this idea that there's a sort of natural law. Think of that, nature and law together. That the temperate, just state of sort of peace, concord, that's the objective. That's what's intended. And when you work in relation to this one, in Hinduism, it's going to be Dharma. In Islam, it's going to be called al-Din, the religion. In the Judeo-Christian context, it's the idea of the logos, which is also that's taken from the Greek term for logos, reason. It's also very Socratic or Gnostic. These various sort of religious traditions are going to say that peacefulness, concord, agreement, working together. This is part of human nature. Something else to think about, and we talk about the argument of the Gorgias, the modern argument, the way that Socrates speaks to these modern approaches to ethics and critiques them, really. Could easily criticize them. How Paulus sounds a lot like Bentham and Callicles sounds a lot like the egoist. Socrates contends with both sides of that argument because his view of human nature is different. He doesn't see human nature as rigorously individualistic. He doesn't see it as this competition between the individual and the common good. He sees that part of being human is to be in fellowship, to be in community with others, and that community is this sort of art of balancing everyone's true wants and needs to bring order and lawfulness, to live temperately in relation to each other, self-controlled so that we don't have to control each other, is a big part of Socrates' vision and is echoes a lot of the religious understanding. And we'll get into that, like I said, in part 2. That said, the larger argument of this course has in some ways relates to this idea. Some scholars or some thinkers, some philosophers and religious scholars talk about the traditional versus modern. That can be a useful distinction. Socrates and the religions being the traditional, traditional approach to morals and ethics versus the modern approaches like utilitarianism, egoism. There's something to be said for that. However, I would argue that there are actually some modern attempts of things that look similar to some of the traditional ones. And quite honestly, we're going to look at the Euthyphro dilemma and what I call religious morality unconcerned with virtue, unconcerned with excellence and becoming good. That sounds, at some level, the defenders of a sort of what's often called divine command. This idea that God is God because he's power, power is power, God is power because God is power. What God says goes. There is no real right and wrong. There's only what God says and what God doesn't say. That God can change his mind or not. But what makes it right is God's power. There's actually not much difference between that religious view and Nietzsche's idea of the will to power. It's just that Nietzsche doesn't believe that God has the power. He believes there should be this overman, this superman, this Übermensch that grasps power, the will to power, that uses power to excel for his own benefit, and that actually is what benefits society, and that the strong should rule, much like Callicles. There is a religious approach that says, yeah, the strong rule, the strong is God, and anybody who rightly discerns what God wants should be the strong and should rule with an iron fist. That goes back to ancient times. So, and there's a tradition of that. It's more readily embraced and more widely accepted, perhaps, in a modern context than, say, in the broader religious context when you get into the sort of virtue positions, and I'm kind of showing my hand there, of certain religious expressions within Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, but they all have expressions that echo with a certain modern power basis or a certain modern idea of the most good for the most or the tribe. Um, there are ancient traditions that sound a lot like either utilitarian or egoistic, power based, rule based, obedience based, like raw power and command. What I typically mean, and what most scholars who talk about traditional and modern mean by traditional, usually has a sort of richer idea that has to do with this idea that Socrates talks about of temperance, self control, justice as part of the very makeup of the universe. Right. So I don't think the sort of temporal distinction is 100% accurate. It's not ancient tradition versus newfangled modernism. It can seem like that. It often gets talked about that way. It's also not necessarily religious versus non-religious. Like I just said, there's this Euthyphro dialogue, this Euthyphro dilemma that we'll talk about. Uh, Euthyphro is very religious, but he's religious in a way that's very different from, say, the religion of the Apostle Paul, or of the Psalms in the Hebrew Scriptures. Right, the Psalms. Um, we'll get into this when we get into the Euthyphro. I won't give it away, but so it can, because the modern world tends to be more mechanistic, because the modern world tends to be less religious. Um, these distinctions can make some sense, and they tend to get used. But I think the real issue is the question of is ethics and morality, does the understanding of human nature have to do with becoming what is the nature of what is intended for humans, and that intention being good, and that good having something to relate to justice and temperance, which have an actual being in the sort of fibers of the universe, actual being and reality rooted in the source or creator of the universe, or is it just mere calculation and rule keeping? Right, that's the real distinction. Um, Calculation, manipulation, bargaining versus becoming what is intended in the design, right? Are humans designed to fulfill certain things and act in certain ways, and therefore living in line with that order through temperance and self control is what produces good people, and being a good person allows you to make right decisions? That's one way of approaching it. Or is there just this power out there that sets certain things into motion, be it raw biology, raw chemical, raw physics, raw self interest, um, evolutionary reciprocity, survival, that requires you to be calculating and sort of maintaining rules based on a certain raw sense of power for survival. So I like to talk about what we're going to be looking at is an argument between the sort of virtue or wisdom tradition versus a sort of magical or mechanical approach, right? Are ethics based on virtue, becoming excellent, lining up with the nature of what is intended in the universe by the source of the universe? Or is virtue and ethics and morality and ethics more about just sort of this magical bargaining with certain powers or mechanical interactions with the just raw power structure realities of the universe? Which one is it, right? If it's virtue and wisdom that's rooted in becoming, then what Socrates says, right, it's better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. That only works if there's something higher, richer, deeper that has to do with the essence and the core of the universe that may not always be initially visible and evident, versus something that's magical and mechanical that's like moves towards, yeah, the survival of myself and the society, and the navigating and the maneuvering between the disparate and discordant desires of myself versus the common good. The virtue wisdom tradition says if we all approach life as an attempt to be virtuous, good, true, and just, self controlled, temperate, courageous, that we will, from those inward realities, create a balanced, temperate, healthy, lawful, just society, because it won't be based in anybody's power over anybody else. But if we take that mechanical or magical approach, then someone always has to grasp at power, and there's this conflict between how is that power balanced between an individual desire and the desire of the whole. The virtue wisdom tradition is based in relationship and community. The sort of magical mechanical tradition, I mean, it's simply that. It's very mechanical. It's based in raw sort of power relations and power politics. So we'll move on from there. We're going to be looking a little bit at the Creto, and then we'll kind of introduce that some of the core shared ideas of that sort of virtue, that virtue wisdom tradition, and then we'll get into those, and then we'll look a little bit at the differences between the various religions as well.